Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome to Tutti a Casa. We are back. After the summer break, we are here again with great guests, engaging topics, and wonderful broadcast. And tonight we are starting with the presentation of a new translation of Curzio Malaparte's book, Diary of a Foreigner in Paris, that has just been translated. And we have a wonderful panel. And my duty for the evening is only to introduce the colleague who has gladly accepted to chair this panel of scholars, translators, professors. And it's Jenny McPhee. Jenny McPhee is a professor here at New York University. She teaches translation, and she's the director of the Center for Applied Liberal Arts. She's also an author in her own right of 3 novels. And among other authors, she translated from the Italian into English. I just want to remember Natalia Ginsburg, Primo Levi, Giacomo Leopardi, Curzio Malaparte, which she translated The Kremlin Ball, Anna Maria Ortese, Paolo Marensik, and Pope John Paul II. I also want to say that Jenny is just the perfect colleague you want to have with you. And we have engaged in so many different presentations of films and books. And I just am looking forward to the conversation she's hosting with her amazing panel of guests. And I just want to remember that Curzio Malaparte, for quite a long time, given his political persuasions, a controversial personality, was considered some sort of a pariah in the panorama of Italian literature. And I have to say that Gianni, along some of her guests, is responsible for what in Italian we call sdoganamento, for having had Malaparte pass custom and become available, especially to the American people. So I'm very grateful for what she has done for Italian literature through translations and many more endeavors. And I'm very grateful for her constant collaboration with Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimò. And I just wish her and her guests a wonderful evening. And now I'm going to listen and enjoy with you. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Stefano. It is so wonderful to be here at the virtual Casa Italiana in this new season of Tutti a Casa. I really miss being downstairs at the theater on 12th Street, but one silver lining is that I can join this Malaparte discussion from where I am right now in Tuscany, which seems somehow fitting given that Malaparte was born not far from where I am right now. So I'd like to just start off this evening's discussion by introducing first our illustrious panel. Stephen Twilley is the senior managing editor of the online magazine Public Books, where he also serves as a section editor for literature and translation. His own translations include, in addition to Diary of a Foreigner in Paris, Francesco Pacifico's The Story of My Purity, Marina Mander's The First True Lie, and Giuseppe Tomasi's di Lampedusa, The Professor and the Siren. That was beautiful, by the way. I love that. I've had the good fortune to participate in other Malaparte translation events with Stephen, and it's always a pleasure to hear his perspective on both Malaparte and translation. Our next panelist is Franco Baldasso. He's an assistant professor and director of the Italian program at Bard College. He is most recently the author of Curzio Malaparte, The Cruelty of Literature, Caput la Pelle, and the Fall of European Civilization. He is currently finalizing a new book entitled Against Redemption, Literary Dissent during the Transition from Fascism to Democracy in Italy. Franco has been the recipient of the prestigious Rome Prize at the American Academy in Rome and has been a visiting fellow at NYU's Remarque Institute for the Study of Europe and its neighbors. Franco and I have collaborated on a number of Italian literature and cultural initiatives, and we share an obsession with Elsa Morante, and we are both devotees of classic Italian film. Edmund White's prodigious and varied literary output includes memoirs, biographies, plays, and 13 novels, including his most recent, A Saint from Texas, or is that 14, Ed? which I highly recommend. It's a wonderful novel. Ed lived in Paris from 1983 to 1998, and France and the French have figured significantly in his life and art. He has written a biography of Proust and Genet and a memoir of his time living in Paris entitled The Flaneur. He has won numerous awards and accolades, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Book Critics Circle Award, a National Book Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award, a Penn Sol Bellow Award for Achievement in American Fiction, and also wrote the beautiful introduction to the translation of Diary of a Foreigner in Paris. So welcome to you all, and thank you for participating in this conversation about Curzio Malaparte. The plan for this evening is that I will ask each of our panelists to help contextualize the Diary of Malaparte's life and work, and then Stephen will read a short excerpt from his translation, and then our panelists can ask questions of each other before we open the conversation up to you, our listeners. So whether you're following us on Facebook or YouTube, please leave your questions in the comment section below, and we'll be happy to address them at the end, time permitting. So before I turn to our panelists, for those of you who may not be familiar with the writer Curzio Malaparte, I wanted to give you a nutshell idea of who he was so that when our panelists elaborate on this author and his work, you'll have some context. Arguably one of the great chroniclers of 20th century Europe, Curzio Malaparte was an Italian diplomat, journalist, novelist, filmmaker, playwright, diarist, and consummate hobnobber with the European aristocracy, as well as the cultural and intellectual elite, while claiming to be a man of the people. He was born Eric Suckert. His father was German, his mother from Lombardia. He was born in 1898 in Prato, as I said, just down the road, and he died in 1957. At the age of 28, he invented for himself the pseudonym Curzio Malaparte, a play on the name Bonaparte. Malaparte was a prolific writer. Every project that eventually made its way into print, he might have had 10 more that remained at some stage of potential. And in fact, the diary wasn't published until almost a decade after his death. He is best known for his novels Caput, published in 1944, and The Skin in 1949. He's also renowned for having supported the rise of Italian fascism and Benito Mussolini, though he was later arrested numerous times by the regime, something he refers to often in the diary. He is also known for the architecturally astonishing house he built for himself on the island of Capri, La Casa Malaparte, which would later famously feature in Jean-Luc Godard's film The McPhee, or in English, Contempt. So I was first introduced to Malaparte in my 20s through his book Maledetti Toscani, or Those Cursed Tuscans, which is a hilarious and brutal analysis of the Tuscan character. I then read Caput and The Skin and found his prose intense, destabilizing, powerful, gorgeous, and devastating. His blurring of fiction and nonfiction as a literary man prefigures Roth, Doctorow, and Kapuscinski. However, whenever I would mention his name among my Italian family and friends, commenting on how remarkable a writer I thought Malaparte was, inevitably they would pronounce either fascista, comunista, or opportunista, and then abruptly change the subject. The level of shame and discomfort Malaparte elicited was palpable, which only made me want to know more about this intensely suave and brutal writer. So when years later I had the opportunity to translate Malaparte's unfinished The Kremlin Ball about the rise of Stalin and a damning portrait of the Soviet elite in the 1920s, in the spirit of opportunista, I did so. So now it gives me great pleasure to turn to Stephen, who has done not only a beautiful, sensitive translation of Malaparte's Diary of a Foreigner in Paris, He has given us, I believe, the closest version of the diary to what Malaparte intended by comparing the Italian and French versions while doing his own translation. It's actually a remarkable feat of literary archaeology, Stephen. So would you place the diary in his context a bit and then tell us about your process in doing this translation?
Sure. Thank you, Jenny, both for the introduction, for that context, and for staying up late to do this. I wanted to put the book in kind of immediate historical context because it's not necessarily a period that most people know that much about. It's not the war, and it's not the 60s in Paris. What is it about 1947, and why in 1947 most lay people would ask, why did Malaparte leave Italy? Why specifically did he go to Paris? And why, once there, did he start a book called a diary that was nonetheless pretty clearly always meant for public consumption, because that wasn't a form he'd used before. And then finally, I wanted to speak to why, in the end, it was unfinished and didn't get published during his lifetime. To the first point, as everybody here at least knows, at the end of World War II, Malaparte had managed to end up on the right side, acting as this liaison officer between the Italian army and the Allies that were driving the Germans up the peninsula and into surrender. However, again, as most people know, the aftermath of the war was still a dangerous time for anybody with fascist ties. The war had turned into something more like a civil war between partisans and fascists. And even though I said he'd end up on the right side, he was still arrested often, and he was still the subject to attacks from both the left and the right that were certainly wearing on him. He ultimately avoided an official purge. The decision that came down in February 1947, thanks to, it appears, his friendship with Palmiro Togliatti, the Italian communist leader, who'd been the Minister of Justice in a unity government. So that saved him at the time. And then the next month, he got his passport back and probably started looking around. It might have been a good time to get out of town while he still could. I'm sure this sense was only increased in May of 1947. There's the so-called exclusion crisis, where the socialists and communists, both in France and Italy, are excluded from government. And this, it appears, at the request of the U.S. President Truman, who basically said, you're not going to get any Marshall Plan funds if you keep these people in the government. So they're kicked out, and the whole kind of political environment in Italy becomes kind of more radicalized, more polarized, and preparations are made for the next general election to take place in April of 1948. And Malaparte, with some good reason, probably feared what would happen if the unified left won those elections. And so it seemed like a good time to get out while he still could, as I said. But so why Paris? So he had previously spent a lot of important time there. As most people know, he enrolled in the French Foreign Legion when he was just 16 in 1914 to fight for France in World War I while Italy was still neutral. He ended up fighting in the Italian army in the Dolomites and then on the French front in 1918. And then he was there. He was in Paris in 1919 for the Treaty of Versailles, attached to the Italian delegation. And it's not surprising that this experience at age 20 of Paris, all this after fighting in the trenches with these men and fighting for France and fighting for Italy, was going to be a source of inspiration and nostalgia. A bit later, between 1923 and 1925, by then he's more or less the kind of leading fascist intellectual. And he's sent to Paris officially to liaise with the fascist syndicalist groups abroad, in this capacity he sought out collaborations with some more right-leaning presses. But less nobly, he was also there to monitor some like left-wing, or at least the exile groups from Italy. And it's not one of his, it's one of the worst things. It involves a cover-up of a murder probably, and some bad stuff that doesn't even make it into the Wikipedia entries. But he made some good friends at that time. That's when people like Jean Cocteau and Daniel Alavi. Then jump forward a bit to the early 30s, where he becomes kind of a literary star for his how-to manual on the technique du coup d'état. And so now he's ushered into the Grand Salon and meeting all the leading artists, actresses, diplomats, etc. of the day. Really probably having the time of his life. And when it comes to an end in 1933, and he's sentenced to the 5 years of internal exile in Lipari, and this is not, as is commonly thought, for any kind of anti-fascist activity, but for insulting the aviation hero Italo Balbo. And then in the end, he only spends a couple months there, but he makes a lot of it. Says he's been there for 5 years. To the extent that he opens this diary saying, "I finally returned to Paris after 14 years of exile in Italy." So just really kind of turning things on their head, that he was, in exile. You feel like he's kind of coming home in a sense to Paris. But at any rate, it certainly seemed like a good place for him to write and to build up his reputation again while things settled down politically in Italy. Now, why did he use something called a diary? He's working on several projects at once. Certainly The Skin, which becomes, as Jenny mentioned, his second enduringly famous book after Caput, The Kremlin Ball, translated by Jenny. A book of poetry, a couple of these plays, these French language plays, newspaper articles on the situation in Italy, and this diary. So working on several different projects. But if he's never used a diary form before, the fact that most of his books do feature Malaparte, as the main character, and they are less novels than kind of a series of scenes, anecdotes, it's not that far off. But it is curious like why he particularly wants to use the form with the date, and it's much more tied to the present tense. And I wonder if one of the kind of unstated aims of the diary is to convince people that in fact he was an anti-fascist in his bones all along, or at least he was doing his own form of resistance, a claim that, as we'll see, wasn't particularly believed. It seemed like the diary form kind of performs intimacy in a way that his other books do not. It might be, he hoped, read with a more sympathetic eye, because here he is, somebody famously not known for earnestness, was here maybe giving us what he really thought, what he really felt. Maybe it'd be more credible somehow when he was speaking of how he was in fact performing resistance, when it was in the diary form. So that's one theory, at least, that I have. It's another way that this book is different. The stakes are lower, certainly, in many ways. Like there's no war. He's not reporting from the Eastern Front. He's not in American-occupied Naples. He's attending salons and dinner parties. On the other hand, I was thinking the stakes are higher in one way, in that he is less of an observer here, less of a voyeur. It really is about himself, and he's the protagonist in a different way. And in the worst case scenario, if he doesn't get this right, if he doesn't convince people that he in fact was not a collaborator, was not a fascist, he still could be shot in a purge or unofficially. So it actually raises the stakes in a way that are not immediately apparent. And finally, I just wanted to talk about how why the book wasn't finished. Well, in the end, his attempts to be accepted as an anti-fascist resistant were not successful. The new leading edge of writers, the existentialists and the proponents of kind of committed literature, Sartre, Camus, Aragon, they deliberately ignored him while he was there, and just what Maurizio Serra refers to as this kind of Italian deep throats, kind of would come up and just report on more and more kind of bad things from his past. His plays that he did manage to get produced drew crowds, but also some pretty fierce criticism, not only for his politics, but also for his French, which he was too proud to have anybody correct. He says, I write as if I were a native, but the French people disagreed. He actually came close to fighting a sword duel with one of these critics, Francis Ambrière, that only didn't happen because of some kind of somewhat manufactured misunderstanding on the part of Ambrière, where when Malaparte's seconds went over to Ambrière's house, they found him not at home. So, and his wife told them to come back later. They came back at the later time, and then were able to give the demand for the duel. But then when they showed up 48 hours after that time, they were told that, oh no, I was here 48 hours ago, because supposedly my rules of chivalry are such that, like, I committed to being here 48 hours after you first came, et cetera. So it didn't happen, just as well. In any case, the last dated entry is from December 19th, 1948. Even though he was actually in Paris through most of 49 with trips to Switzerland and back to Italy. But apparently by early 49, I guess Paris had enough of Malaparte. It was clear that the book, its reason for being had kind of faded away. Like it was not going to have a happy ending. The diary was not going to be published. But meanwhile, the Christian Democrats, with lots of foreign intervention, had won the plurality of votes in the 1948 election. And then The Skin, his second famous book, had been published in 1949. So he was able at that point to return to Italy in some safety and triumph. And Jenny, I think that's a kind of a natural stopping place. I could go on to talk about the method or the two editions, et cetera, but I just as soon give folks a chance to speak more about context, and maybe we can return to that.
Perfect. That's great. So now I wanted to just turn to Franco, who has written a wonderful and important book on Malaparte's literary and artistic output and how it relates to European decadence. And I just was wondering, Franco, if you could tell us how you see this book, this diary, fitting into Malaparte's overall literary trajectory, and then maybe give us a sense of Malaparte's work in the theater and cinema.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here to have the opportunity to speak about Malaparte, especially a difficult book like this one, The Diary of a Foreigner in Paris, that, by the way, hasn't been republished since the 60s in Italy, just because it's a controversial book. And I really hope that soon we're going to have a new edition, just because also, philologically speaking, it's a messy book. It's written half in Italian, half in French, and it probably mirrors the moment, I wouldn't say the confusion, but the moment, the difficult moment that Malaparte had after the 40s. Of course, his connection with the previous regime, they were evident, and he tried to hide them. In a way that often didn't help him. Most of fascist intellectuals in Italy then were converting really to communism, or even going back to, with a sort of expiation, going back to the ranks of the Christian Democrats, as Stephen already suggested. Malaparte instead staunchly remained, wanted to be like an isolated figure. And this diary is, in my opinion, an amazing document, because you see a character that at the beginning is well-formed, disgregating, little by little, page after page. In fact, the book itself doesn't, it doesn't finish. There's not an ending. There's not like a last entry in which you get the redemption of what I thought did, and so on and so forth, in my previous career as a fascist intellectual. No. Malaparte goes to Paris with the idea of finding a new heaven after realizing that for him it's impossible to stay in Italy. his memories of Paris are really fond because despite he was seen as a fascist intellectual, despite being a right-wing intellectual and of the like of Ernst Jünger and a number of other French intellectuals, especially in the 30s, he was very close to Daniel Halévy, who was a friend of Proust, and so he connected very well with the French intelligentsia, Mauriac and other intellectuals. He speaks about that in his old friends. He speaks about his old friends in the diary. But the situation has changed dramatically, and he's just in between his two big works. Caput, 1944, in which he describes, we already mentioned them, but it's better to locate this book between the two big books, which is, well, the first one is Caput, that is arguably his masterpiece, that is the flamboyant, baroque, but also really powerful account of Europe occupied by the Nazi, under Nazi rule. With encounters that are really memorable, and with all the violence, and in which you can see possibly despite all the Nazi atrocity, the real, I think one of the real point of the book is the fact that you see that human beings are not anymore the subject of their own history, and at the end of the book, with Malaparte coming back from all this in Eastern Europe, in Northern Europe, he comes back to Naples and he's trying to find a humanity that is completely lost because technology has become the subject of history. So between this book that was like, one of the great first interpretation of Second World War, and the second book that is instead La Pelle, the skin, that Stephen mentioned before, which is instead the story of Italy occupied, invaded by the American, by the American army.
It may be coming.
Exactly. In fact, I had to be careful. So you see, basically, the theme of La Pelle is exactly the impossibility of establishing a morality for Europe, a morality that would not take into account the great things we learn from Second World War, that there's no army that is just a liberator, but is also an occupier. In fact, there are scenes that are amazing and very difficult to read about the occupation of Naples, the widespread prostitution, and there's a lot of, really, that book was a can of worm. He, back in 1949, published the book, and possibly that was his bigger literary success. I was really worldwide. Between these two books, there is this moment in which he, in a way, is isolating himself more and more. He understands that his idea of literature, and also his idea of film, because this book is, this diary of a foreigner in Paris, in my opinion, has a strong link to what was going on in Italy, which is neorealism. His idea of literature is opposite to neorealism. And he's going to show that in his film in 1951, The Forbidden Christ, Il Cristo Proibito. Why I'm saying that? At the beginning of the book, after this preface about what a diary means to him, and we can unravel that later, there is this voyage of Malaparte and Rossellini together in the same plane to go to Paris. And they're discussing about what remains of Europe. And you see that there is a distance, because for Rossellini, there is a tomorrow. Everybody remembers the beautiful image in which Rome Open City ends, and is that the redemption of the possible redemption of the Italian nation after the crimes of fascism. There is no redemption in this diary of a foreigner in Paris. Malaparte tries hard to stick also to these cultural traditions, but I see a man that is having difficulty to keep up with the current scene, and it is so literally self-aware that he knows that the idea of neorealism of representing the epic of a new nation cannot fit his political agenda, of course, but also his literary agenda. And we're going to see that in his last film, that in a way criticizes the neorealist claim of being able to represent the true life. Is like, there's always an interpretation, which means also there's also an ideology in the act of writing and in the act of filmmaking, which I think in this book comes here and there, because it's not as powerful as in La Pelle, The Skin, or in his last film. And there is, again, a lot to say about this because he's a controversial figure who will never be able to come to terms with his fascist past. But I would like now to leave the room for discussion because there's so many other topics.
That was very wonderful, Franco, and really interesting about the opening with Rossellini. I was really kind of mystified about that, but now I have it much more clear about what he was up to, because he's always up to something. It's not just ever name dropping the way one of things with Malaparte. He was really up to something, and that contrast with neorealism is really interesting. So Ed, you as a devoted Francophile and Italophile, would you tell us more about Malaparte and his relationship to Paris, to the city? There's also here in this diary a celebration of Paris in a Malapartean way, and how he was received by the French and French society and French intellectuals. Is Ed
Looks like
Ed's frozen. So, what a shame, because Ed would have a lot of wonderful things to say about that. But we can keep going, and maybe he'll come back. Maybe he'll unfreeze at some point. But I just wanted to pick up a little bit then, Franco, on what you were talking about and ask Stephen to his opinion on this. But that the idea of art as redemption for the evils of history, right? That is something that Malaparte just won't have anything to do with. And you can see that again, that theme here in the diaries. How do you see that sort of playing itself out in his relationship with the French and the French intellectuals?
Well, yeah, another big topic that is expressed throughout the book is exactly the relationship with his idea of France. His idea of France is close. He says at a certain point, a famous square of Paris is not just a square, but it's an idea. And meaning there is so much behind the visual aspects, but also the content that are all the icons of what it means to be French, that is yet to be unraveled and to find a solution, or an original solution after the Second World War. The big problem is that the France that he had in mind collapsed before Vichy. And he knows it very well, and he's trying to find out if there is a possibility of a new France. But his eye is not to say he's biased, but is not in those years, Sartre was writing existentialism is a humanism. Malaparte replies instead that the return to human after totalitarianism is a sort of return to good thoughts, good habits, but it's really not fostered by a real reconsideration of what has happened. The fact is that he doesn't, to complicate the frame, is what he does with himself, because the book is also an attempt to, really to redeem himself of a fascist past, but in a way that it is kind of clumsy, because definitely the best pages of these books, the best parts of these documents is when he unleashes his imagination to fantastic images, like the one of that almost concludes the book about the Pecci Blunt family. They were two important, a very important literary salon in Italy, and of course she was a noblewoman. He was a noble, but of American noble, but of a Jewish origin, and therefore the image is like one of their big parties, that there is like opera singers and stuff, but nobody came to the party because it was already the time of the anti-Semitic laws in Italy. And this image is ghastly, it's spectral, like many of images that he scatters throughout this book and also his other books. But the fact is that the idea that we talk about, the idea of redemption, is something that he cannot cope with because he writes about the cruelty of writing, and he said that the task of us writers today has to be, you have to be ruthless to our past and our present, and of course this it is also a way to cover up his own past. On one hand, we have Malaparte that is ruthless towards what is testifying, knowing that being the voyeur of the Second World War is like a spectacle in itself, and a way to cancel out his own past as a fascist. And on the other, you have an intellectual, extremely smart intellectual, a right-wing intellectual that is probably unable to process his past in ways that are as ruthless as what he does with the external world. And in the pages of these diaries are amazing from this perspective, because you see this contradiction. Because at a certain point,
true, and you also see so vividly and beautifully captured by your translation, Stephen. You see the his ruthlessness, but at the same time, it's always in juxtaposition with the incredible beauty of his images and language. I mean, it's just breathtaking, and that combination is what makes him just so as a great writer. So, Stephen, can we hear a little bit from the translation? Would you read us?
Yeah.
Sure, of course. I can't help. I just want to pick up real quickly at what Franco was saying about how something about his kind of lifelong aversion to redemption also fits in a way, though, with his agenda against kind of resistance claims. Because I was thinking, if he's unhappy with how the French treat 1940, their defeat, as something that has to be redeemed by the resistance, he says, no, you just continued fighting under a different way. You don't have to redeem anything. That's in a way it's kind of convenient for him. It kind of works for him. He doesn't want the resistance to be seen as a redemption of France, because that's not something that he can strongly identify with. So that his approach to resistance and his approach to redemption are interlocked in an important way, I think there. But now, yes, to fulfill your request. So I chose an early entry, but not the first one, which is maybe a better setup for everybody else. But I've read that one a few other times, and I think this one will do. So here, this is from July 1947. He is with the ambassador Quaroni, who's an ambassador in Afghanistan. He explains during the war. So first they talk about Afghanistan, then they talk a bit about Moscow, and then Malaparte says, then we talk about France. He talks about it with an almost feminine elegance, choosing his words, caressing them with his refined, discreet smile. And here again are the Goncourt speaking of France, of Paris, of the French. In their porcelain-filled study, once again he is the sage 17th century Jesuit who returns to Europe, to this Europe, after having discovered in an unknown, mysterious, and distant fairy tale land a city, a people or a state, a splendid civilization threatened by the wind, which the desert sand threatens to swallow up, and which, little by little, when the spring wind blows, sweeping away the sand, emerges from its tomb of dust, from its shroud of impalpable sand, and discloses its towers, belfries, roofs, and trees, the terraces of its mother-of-pearl palaces, the golden roof tiles, the green of its gardens, where the water fountains begin to sweetly sing again. He speaks, smiling, and little by little I see this city rise at the base of the steppes of Europe, see this city, this people, this state, this nation and its towers, statues, and domes, its people with the ironic gaze of disinterred statues, the gentle smile of peoples come back to life. He has faith in France, the affectionate faith that collectors have in their delicate porcelains, which it seems the mildest breeze could crack, and against which nothing has prevailed, not centuries, not wars, not revolutions, not floods, not fires, not barbarian invasions. He cites books and verses, speaks of paintings, of old Bonnard who makes, now that he is on the far edge of life, already brushed by death, his youngest, most beautiful paintings. He speaks of a certain old politician, of his wisdom, of the wisdom despite everything of the French people, of this French youth that is so generous, so courageous, of the supremely French way in which this youth has demonstrated its love of death, not a morbid but a smiling love, the ancient love of death, that breathes in the verses of Ronsard, that shines through in the young French knights of Francis I. He cites the verses of a French poet of our own time. King Francis did not die in Pavia. No, it is possible to save one's honor and not die. Then he asks if I'm happy with the way I've been received in Paris. I tell him that I am. Then he recounts how, one day, 2 months prior to my arrival in France, which is truly odd given that I applied for a visa from the French embassy in Rome only 2 days before leaving and obtained it in 10 minutes. Bidault told him, as if in passing, "Did you know Malaparte would like to come to Paris, but I haven't yet decided whether I'll give him a visa." "And why not?" Quaroni says. "Because during the war he wrote against France." "But that's not true," I say. "During the entire war, I didn't write a single line about France." "I know," Quaroni replies, "and I told him as much, but I didn't want to make it a personal matter. I know from personal experience that during 20 years of fascism, you were under attack by fascist newspapers for your friendship toward France, and that during the war you did your duty as a free man, that you were part of the resistance. I wanted to make it a matter of general regulations. I told Bidault that I currently had on my desk the passport of Pierre Cotte, who hoped to travel to Italy. If he had denied your visa, I would have denied Pierre Cotte's, and I was confident that Rome would have approved." Bidault was quite amazed by my reaction, I believe, but he said nothing. He probably considered you a collaborator. "He's not the only one," I say, and it's even quite amusing to see how much the French consider me a collaborator. At times, I have the desire to respond forcefully, to ask what certain people's resistance really consisted of. But what would be the point? "It's of no importance," Quaroni says, smiling. "What one thinks of people has so little importance these days. When they tire of considering you a collaborator, they'll change their mind about you. As you will note, have already been told, it's the price of glory." "But," I ask, "what would they say about me had I actually been a collaborator?" Quaroni replies, smiling, "They would salute you as a hero of the resistance." So, and I chose that apart because I mean it's early days, so that's Malaparte's vision of like the best case scenario. If it really goes well, everybody really believes his case.
So now I have a question. Malaparte, we see him. He was rejected finally by both the French and the Italians, and sort of would we see what happened to him as what we now call cancel culture at work? I mean, despite his recent resurgence, his books are being republished in Italy, France, and the U.S., and now I see them in airports in Italy. I still don't think that his contribution to literature and his influence on the novel, the essay, the diary is sufficiently acknowledged or appreciated, even though Milan Kundera called him one of the most significant literary figures of the 20th century. So he was doing all sorts of things stylistically, content-wise, way before others. Things like autofiction, the brutal expose, the blending of fiction and fact, that are now kind of just the norm. So was he canceled?
Well, in a way, he was. Interesting enough, though, and Malaparte, despite he was completely canceled out from academic works or even accounts of that period, despite how prominent was his figure. I have just one example that comes from my research. When his film, The Forbidden Christ, came out, André Bazin, the most important film critic of neorealism, wrote fantastic review saying that this film is a masterpiece, despite saying, but Malaparte, of course, is a controversial figure. This review is the only piece by Bazin that's not been translated into Italian in all these years. And I had to find the French version of it because, of course, there was a certain, it was totally rejected by the Italian left and also by the Italian right, because for the Italian right, he was a sort of a traitor. I don't know if you can establish a truth, but a definite truth, but as a matter of fact, he tried to stay close to his idea of a national revolution, and that, of course, as many other Italians, and especially a lot of Italian intellectual artists, writers, especially during the 20s, they thought that Mussolini could be the person to deliver modernity to Italy. I think his work, and why also it's been kind of cancelled from academic, official accounts of the period, is because as many other Italian intellectuals of the 20s, he saw in fascism a possible modernization of the country, and he pushed forward to it, taking compromises that are clearly far from our sensibility today. And I think this, in the long run, caused the impossibility to frame it in any category that would save his work as something that can be part of the broader frame. Something else we forget about the 20s and 30s in Italy is how flourishing was, for instance, the idea of magical realism. Bontempelli, Paola Masino are great writers that have been recently translated into English too, that work an idea of magical realism as a fascist art. And Malaparte was part of it, despite the other, arguments with Bontempelli and so on and so forth. If his writing is full of cosmopolitan ideas, and these cosmopolitan ideas very often were right-wing. Something that, of course, it was extremely problematic, not just in Italy and France, but in general, to think about today.
Thank you, Franco, and I want to hear what you have to say, Stephen, but I see that Ed is back. I don't know if you heard my question, Ed, but I'll just say it again. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about Malaparte's relationship to Paris and to both to the city and to the French society, French intellectuals, and how you see that relationship.
Well, I mean, can you hear me?
Yes.
He was a great reader of French literature, and in this book, he oftentimes quotes Chateaubriand, and he's very obsessed with Racine, and wonders how is the correct way of producing Racine, and he gets into all these debates. But the important thing is to say the existentialists hated him, but I think other Italian writers had that problem too, and certainly Jean Genot, the French writer, who was also falsely accused. Well, he was really falsely accused of being a fascist sympathizer. He was forbidden to publish for almost 10 years by the communists who were the leaders of the writers' union in France. But anyway, I think Malaparte really worshipped the French, and he had this strange notion that he oftentimes cites in this book of Descartes, and he's always talking about Descartes. I have the feeling he probably never read a word of Descartes, but I think what it means for him is that the rational, cool, realistic French point of view, which is fair enough. But he always has memorable but slightly crazy things to say, like that the Place de la Concorde is an idea rather than a piazza, and the idea is Cartesian. And I don't know, he has very eccentric opinions, but they all turn into memorable phrases. I mean, he's a really great phrase maker, among other things.
Yeah, he's beautiful. That whole sequence on Place de la Concorde was very mysterious to me. It sounded so good, but I was like, what are you actually saying here?
Well,
Stephen, can you?
The Place de la Concorde doesn't really have any limits. I mean, there are only buildings on one side of it, and on the other three sides, it's all open. So it's a piazza. It's not a piazza because there aren't palazzi surrounding it, except on one side, and it's very beautifully laid out. But I don't know, what does it mean? I oftentimes ask that about many things he says. Well, and of course, I think he had a pretty rough reception in France. I mean, especially from people like Camus, gave him the cold shoulder, and I think people saw him either as old-fashioned or as a fascist, or anyway, not on the new existentialist bandwagon. And other writers suffered the same thing. Pasolini, for instance.
I wondered about the title too, Diary of a Foreigner in Paris. You know, that word foreigner, it seems very deliberate and very sort of aggressive and maybe ironic, because he always felt very French himself. You know, he wrote half in French.
Did you translate it directly from, is that the title in French?
Yeah, no, it's a very literal translation. I remember when I should first propose or maybe like an early draft to Edwin and NYRB Classics, they said they wanted to change it. And for a long time, it was just called Paris Journal. But then if you read he uses that term so intentionally, so often, I think it makes the case that like you have to call it that. And indeed, I mean, both the French and the Italian are pretty unambiguous. And then the Dutch translation, the Spanish translation, I think it's just what it is. That is his perspective, that he's going to, he wants to, it is contradictory, like so many things he does, because of course he also says he's, basically, French as well, but he wants to have this kind of estranged viewpoint and from which to give the French some kind of tough love about, how to get over occupation, but it involves being, that little bit of distance that he tries to make for himself by using that term and that perspective.
I always find it also fascinating that, he talks a lot in the diary about German literature and German things, but he never identifies as German.
Well, he doesn't like German things, and he dislikes Goethe, and he doesn't think that Goethe had any influence on European literature. And I don't know. Do you think he's very musical? Does he like music? I don't think he talks about music very often.
Well, if I can intervene, actually, during the 30s and 40s, he prompted a number of translations from German literature into Italian. And not just, he wrote several articles about Goethe, even making fun of Goethe. There are some are very, very funny, especially the famous painting with Goethe lying down in the Roman countryside. He said that nobody can sleep on a couch in the countryside like Goethe does. But besides this, he really was, one of the person who introduced a number of even critical German literature, not just the literature of the 30s, because in a way, of course, he's
one of the things he says is that the real art of the Germans is philosophy, and that the great German writers are Hegel and Nietzsche, and he names other philosophers, and he says that they're superior to the novelists. We barely know the names of German novelists except Fontana, but there aren't that many, and and but I mean that's a very striking. He always the things he says are striking, and in this case, that the philosophers are the great poets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that bit. I mean, even when he says stuff and you're not really sure whether the way he says it is just so elegant and authoritative that you're just like, oh yeah, okay, it is the philosophers. But he had me in them. So we're getting toward the end. Is there anything that any of you wanted to ask Stephen?
One of the things I think it's important to point out is that, and Maurizio Serra points it out in his wonderful biography, is that Malaparte after the Skin never really completed anything. What's the history of the Kremlin Ball? Was that before?
He wrote it. He wrote it during the same period in Paris.
But didn't publish that either while he was. But Franco, he went into theater. He had a couple of plays produced. He started doing cinema. I think he decided that the future was performance, right?
Well, absolutely. Especially when he was in Paris, he tried hard to impress the Parisian audience with the two, by dismantling two figures that were, the key figures of the debate of the period. First of all, Proust with his play Du Côté de chez Proust in 1948. But the one that I think it's actually very, very important is Das Kapital, 1949. Daniel Halevi, that is the intellectual figure that kind of protected him in Paris, said that I remember the first night of that play in which the French intelligentsia, even before seeing the play, already decided that it was a capital without interest. That's the title of one of the reviews of the time, saying basically that Malaparte was already excluded by for whatever he would have done with that play because of course of his ideas. I'm not saying that his ideas were correct or whatever, but I'm just saying that in the diary you can find this enmity and this difficulty to be in dialogue, especially after the war. And I think it would be it couldn't have been otherwise, because of course after such an impressive amount of violence, having people from either side in dialogue, I think it would have been a diplomatic masterpiece. However, Das Kapital really pinpoints one of the problems of the left by basically addressing the problem of the issue of the cult of personality, trying to dismantle the idea of Marx as a sort of icon of the revolution by presenting a Marx that has to choose between writing his own books and creating a revolution or saving his children. And it's a very interesting play, and I think it should be meditated, especially for his, because it was made in 1949. It had some replicas, especially in Italy, in the 70s, and it goes against the grain. And again, the fact that he was also a figure that liked to be to say the opposite of what was the norm of the time, speaks of as untimeliness even today.
Yeah.
So,
Do you agree with Sarah that his career after this Paris period was pretty much a disaster, and that he started so many projects and couldn't finish any of them?
I think that after, well, The Skin is a great book. It's not as great as Caputo, in my opinion.
No, I mean, after the Skin, did he ever write ever finish anything?
No, he didn't finish anything, because I think that even this diary, but even the Kremlin Ball, they started as a political polemics, controversy, but then it took different direction. And one direction is like towards and a comprehension of the Cartesian basis, as you said before, of Western civilization. Other directions are kind of spiritual, but he could. I don't think he was able to set his mind to a single project because he started being not in sync with the times. I think his last great work is his film, The Forbidden Christ, and it's very interesting how it was highly received by people like Picasso or other French intellectuals, but he had so incredibly bad reviews in Italy because he was also basically he was talking about the people coming back from Russia, the reduci from war, and that nobody wanted to see because they were not part of the new epic of the resistance. There were people that were in concentration camps after fighting for the fascists. And I think his legacy is especially in this idea of elevating a different truth over politically correctness, whether or not you like him.
So Trust, we just got a question in the chat, which is perfect because it was exactly what I wanted to say sort of in closing, is that there is this beautiful biography by Sarah. Do you want to speak about that for a second, Stephen, and then say, the question is there going to be a translation of the biography of in English? So can you just speak about that a minute?
Yeah, no, just very briefly. I mean, there had been various books about Malaparte and biographies, but the definitive one, came out about a decade ago, originally in French by the diplomat Maurizio Serra, and then translated into Italian the next year. And it's fantastic. I mean, it's so much more comprehensive and sensitive than any other kind of biographical writing about him out there. As far as I know, there aren't any plans yet, but in the kind of pre-discussion,
you would like to translate it, right?
Yeah, I said I'd love to do so, and
So if any publisher is listening, grab him.
Yeah, and I was hoping that this experience of doing this work that was written in both French and Italian, I really felt in certain ways prepares me to do such a work. I mean, Sarah himself living between French, Italian, and English. So I feel like I'm ready to take on that next project.
Good. That would be exciting.
That is fantastic. I really hope that comes to pass. So thank you all so much. This has been a really interesting conversation. I could talk about Malaparte forever. I just think he's one of the most fascinating writers, definitely. And I agree with Kultura that he's really one of the great writers of the 20th century. So I just want to do a little plug for the next Tutti a Casa, which is on October 8th at 5 o'clock, and it's Zavattini in Latin America, Italian neorealism in Cuba, Mexico, and Argentina, which sounds fantastic. And it's Alfonso Aguado, who's a NYU PhD candidate, in conversation with David Brancaleone from the Limerick Institute of Technology. So thank you all for listening, and thank the panelists. It was just wonderful to see you all in this virtual world and to chat with you about something we're all fascinated with. And nice to see you too, Stefano. And I can't wait to do something else with all of you at the Casa. Buonanotte a tutti.
Buonanotte, grazie Jenny.
Grazie mille.
That's
Grazie.
Grazie.